What if you were able to sit down for lunch with some of the greatest leaders in the world? What would you ask? What would they say? Welcome to the Lynch with a Leader podcast, where you're invited to join us in learning the spiritual principles behind big success. Here's your host, Mike Lynch.
Can how you do business day to day be spiritual and be for Christ? I think it can, and so does my guest today, who's a lot more qualified to speak to it than I am. If I've never met you before, my name is Mike, and it is my honor to be on this leadership journey with you, as we're all seeking to be the leaders that we were created to be in the spaces and places that God has put us. Since this podcast has started 234 episodes ago, now we're on episode 235, we have had a passion, and our passion is to help leaders who have a faith bent in their lives and a passion in their lives learn that you can combine those worlds. I don't know if I've had a guest that's spoken to it any better than our guest today, Barry Rowan. Listen, Barry not only has the credentials and the educational background that is just unbelievable, but he's been a part of over 8 businesses, either starting and building or turning around, that have sold for millions and millions and millions of dollars. The key to Barry's life is not just where he went to school or what he did professionally. The key to Barry's life is a crisis of belief that he went through that helped him do a framework that's called the art of leading spiritually in the area of business. I'm going to tell you something. His book is phenomenal. And it is one of those that if you get a copy of The Spiritual Art of Business, that you will be better for, especially if you sort of live in the 9-to-5 business world day to day and you're trying to figure out how to integrate your faith. Barry has dedicated his life now to traveling across the world, helping leaders like you. And today he joins us. So you are in for a treat. I don't know where you're listening from today, but you're going to want a notebook. You're going to want something to write on. I want you to pull up a chair, and I want you to listen in to my conversation with author, business leader, and developer, and just all around solid guy who's living for Jesus in the marketplace, Barry Rowan. Well, Mr. Barry, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Lynch with a Leader. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and it's my real pleasure to be here with you and with all of your great listeners here today.
You know, it's been so fun learning about your journey. You came to a real crisis of belief that steered you to where you are today. But before that happened, walk us a little bit about who you were up till that point and what's gotten you to where you are today.
Yeah, I really came to a surrendered faith, as you mentioned, out of a crisis of meaning in work. But the crisis, in retrospect, was brewing for a long time. I had this steely, strong will that was an uncomfortable bedfellow with this deep longing for God. And grew up on a small ranch in Idaho, was raised in the church. And then when I was in my early 80s, after graduating from undergraduate, I had received a deferred admission to go to Harvard Business School. And I wanted to do something that I thought would enhance my compassion for people. And so I thought about living on the streets. I thought about doing ministry to people in prisons and a whole number of things. And came back from that trip to see my brother where I was considering doing those things. And just a very fundamental conclusion solidified for me, which was the challenge for me was not to live out that compassion in the isolated experience of a year, but to do it Monday morning at 10 o'clock and to live an integrated life. So I'd come to that understanding and then went to business school, joined a startup company that was growing very, very fast and was the CFO, and then got kicked upstairs to be president of that organization. And just these questions began to really emerge in me. And I got invited to a camp in Colorado, and looking out over the beautiful Arkansas River Valley, I just started weeping. And what it was the juxtaposition of the serenity of that environment just stood in such striking contrast to this turmoil within me. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm just sick and tired of living a divided life. And I didn't even know if God was part of the question, let alone part of the answer. But over the next 8 months, I would read 16 books and finally got confronted with Jesus in reading the Gospels. And if he is who he says he is, we need to take him seriously. And when he says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And his command that just haunted me was, any of you who does not give up everything he has can't be my disciple. And I said, well, if that's the way you want it, Lord, it needs to be on your terms, not mine.
Yeah.
And so literally on a run around the lake by our house, I said, I give up. And I came kicking and screaming into the kingdom of heaven with heel marks in the sand, as I would describe it. So,
How would you, because I think everybody at some point experiences that turmoil when they are trying to discover who Jesus is. It's great he's all these things, but who is he to me? How would you describe what that turmoil felt like? Did you think it was normal, or did you go, I know this isn't normal? What were you feeling during all that?
no, it was just sheer pain. It was anguish. And for those of our listeners who have experienced it, I think the anguish of the soul is one of the deepest forms of anguish that there is. And we certainly see that in, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think in many ways, the anguish of that spiritual pain was probably as deep or deeper and more painful than the physical anguish. And so it was just painful, and it was confusion. And I just didn't know what to do. And so I just started on this journey of trying to understand. I wrote this paper called My Confusion Over Christianity, which was 12 pages of questions about, can you be rich and Christian at the same time? And is the Bible a literal or a figurative document? And who is Jesus? And is he really an example of my life? Or is he a downtrodden, pacific, spineless person that I can't admire? And of course, I just completely misunderstood who he was. And so the questions weren't profound in a particular sense. I mean, many people have asked them before, but they were profound for me. And they just got at the very heart of this pain and this confusion. And what I learned through that is that God invites us to enter the place of our confusion, to embrace the questions that we have, because as we embrace the pain, God gives purpose to the pain and brings us through the pain into this place of deeper understanding and clarification.
I love that. I want to go back into that because I think this is so good for people, because I think it's so easy to have a very much a head knowledge of who Jesus is, but none of this that we're going to talk about in a moment is going to make any sense till there's a heart knowledge, till there's this integrated, is the word you used earlier, this integrated faith. Who did you discover Jesus to be that shocked you the most? When you began asking these questions in this self-discovery time, what surprised you most about Jesus?
I think what I was really struck by was his deep sense of integrity, that what he says and what he does are completely congruent. And of course, he's the Word made flesh as we come to understand him more. And so he is the living expression of the truth and the living Word of God. And so what really struck me was just how consistent he is, and also how strong he is.
Yeah.
He just wouldn't let me off the hook, literally. Any of you does not give up everything. And, what does everything mean? It pretty much means everything. And so for me, his invitation to surrender was really the clarification for me. And when I realized that it has to start with giving our entire lives to Christ. And ultimately, then he brings us to the point where every moment of our lives are infused with his Spirit. But that would come later. But it was really just kind of how demanding he was.
Yeah.
If you love me, you'll obey my commands, and that he's really serious about that. And I think the reason is that he loves us more than we can imagine, and he promises to bring us into the fullness of life, and that his joy might be in us, so our joy would be complete, but it has to be on his terms. And I want it on my terms. I wanted to just give a bit of myself to God and let him kind of a bolt on Christianity. And what I really saw in that was, no, he wants to transform the very substance of our being. And in order to do that, we need to give him permission to act in that way. That he is so gracious, which is another thing I realize, is that he will never impose himself on us, but he invites us to surrender ourselves completely to him. And as we do, it gives him permission to do his deep transformative work.
When you began to ask all those questions, I've heard you talk about before, at that time, you were really asking a lot of the wrong questions. You were asking a lot of wrong questions that were giving you some of the wrong answers. And I think everybody finds themselves in wrong question periods in life. What were some of the wrong questions you were asking yourself to try to heal some of the turmoil that was going on inside you?
Well, I think some of the wrong questions were particularly characterized by the wrong answers. So, for example, a question was, where do we find meaning in life? And what's my source of significance? I had in those years, kind of unbeknownst to me, really, an innate fear of insignificance. That is my life going to matter or not? And my wrongful response to that, really, Mike, that started when I was probably 3 years old, was I realized that the way to get through life and my sense was to live a fulfilling life was through achievement. So I realized that, oh, if you are a good student, your teachers like you. If you're a good kid, your parents like you. And I just became this wind-up toy for achievement. Show me something and I'll figure out how to be good at it, whether it's, learning how to use a gun in 8th grade, or whether it's, going to Harvard Business School or leading a business. And, it would take until my mid-40s and the biggest failure of my life for God to show me that I had made achievement my God. And it was through that failure that God really called me into this crucifixion of the God of achievement so it could be replaced by the God of the universe. And that was probably one of the really centerpieces of what I had so wrong for so long, was really worshiping this idol of achievement that I didn't even know was the case.
And that's so good. It's so funny. I've yet to talk, we were talking earlier, of at least 200 plus episodes. I don't know of a great leader who hasn't experienced a great failure. I don't know of a great leader that somewhere in their journey, there's not a story of, man, I hit something I didn't see coming. What happened to you in that failure that you're thankful for now? What would you say looking back on that?
Well, I think what was the biggest failure by the world standards was one of God's greatest achievements as seen through his eyes. And just to provide a little bit of context, I spent 40 years helping to build or turn around 8 businesses. 6 out of the 8 were successful, with the one selling for $10 billion. So, I had a reasonable modicum of success. But I usually talk more about the 2 that were not, because I think we have a lot to learn from that. And I think we just don't talk enough about failure in this society. And it's something we come to fear. And I've really concluded that there are only 2 ways to fail to try and to fail to learn, to learn the messages that God has embedded for us. And in my case, I had joined a large scale startup. This company had won the license to compete with the incumbent phone company in Brazil by committing to build out service to 80 cities in 2 years. So we raised $2.5 billion, hired 4,000 people in 2 years, and it took off like a rocket. I mean, we put on 500,000 customers in the first 10 months. It was the fastest growing company of its kind in the world. The stock price tripled in the first year. We filed to go public. And then, for our listeners who are old enough to remember Paul Harvey, the rest of the story was quite different than the beginning of the story. And we saw some cracks show up in the operations. I got recruited to be the CEO. The short version is we had to lay off 1,500 employees to save the remaining 2,500 jobs. And we ultimately raised another $250 million and sold the company, but it was for dimes on the dollar. And so it was not a success by the world standards. But that business failure paled in comparison to the spiritual anguish that I felt in my soul. And my wife's only requirement for taking this job in Brazil was that I had a bodyguard and a bulletproof car, which I did. And I can remember being on the beaches outside of Rio, just reading Job over and over, and just relating deeply to him. And, when he said, the very thing I hoped for, which was to die, you haven't given me. It's
That's
right.
right.
Something rational, It'd be way happier if I was just up in heaven with you full time, Lord. But out of that, it was a revelation of God for him to say that when the achievement went away, I realized my God went with it. And it took the depth of that experience for God to enter into the depth of my being. And that's where he does some of his deepest work. And the second thing I'm grateful for, in addition to him crucifying the God of achievement and replacing it with the God of the universe, is Jesus' words again haunted me. Any of you does not give up everything he has can't be my disciple. Time it came with a question, which was, I just sensed the Lord asking me, what is the next part of everything that you need to give up? And it was a very odd answer that came to me, which was, I just sensed that I needed to give up any claim on my own future. In other words, was I willing to live fully in the present moment and let God unfold the pattern of my life as he sees fit? And for a long time, I said, no, no, no. It was a level of surrender and a level that involved level of trust that I had not really grown into yet. because I think there's a proportionality between knowing God and trusting him. The more we know him, the more we know he is trustworthy. But then I finally said yes and read a book along the way, met with a spiritual director. The book was called Abandonment to Divine Providence, or it goes by another translation title, which is The Sacrament of the Present Moment. And the essence of that concept is that the path to our deepest fulfillment is to fulfill the duties of the present moment. In other words, Lord, what are you asking me to do right here, right now, in this place? My working definition of righteousness is to do the right thing right here, right now. And so as we just step into that obedience, really, and that congruence with the will of God, that he unfolds this pattern of our lives that conforms to his ultimate plan for us. And so it was a big deal at the time to give that up. But what happened surprised to me coming out of that experience was I just came into this place of freedom that I never knew was possible. And it just sowed the seeds of an underlying joy and gratitude that have really grown and permeated me since then. And those things don't come naturally for me. Joy and gratitude. I'm much more focused on what's left to be done than what's been done. But now God is showing me really the reasons to be grateful.
And I love it because you took all of these experiences in your life and you've put them together in a book called The Spiritual Side of Business. What is the biggest, and I want to unpack it a little bit, what is the biggest thing you want every business leader to know about why God has put them where he's put them and how he wants to use them?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Mike, the title is The Spiritual Art of Business, but the subtitle is Connecting the Daily with the Divine. And that's what I would want them to know, is that it is possible. It is possible to live an integrated life, to live one life under God, where we have given our whole life to God, and then he infuses every moment of our lives with his purpose and his spirit. And so that's what I really want people to know, is that we literally can connect every moment of our lives with our purpose in life. And when we are able to do that, for me, it just made my work life and my entire life come alive. That I, after surrendering my life to Christ, would take the next 8 years and writing 350 pages to myself, mostly in the middle of the night, just wrestling with these questions. And God had to just take me through a succession of paradigm shifts. And one of those fundamentally was that I was looking at life and work all wrong. I was looking at life from the outside in instead of the inside out. I thought, if I just get the right job, somehow I'll be filled up. And the deeper truth is that we live life from the inside out. And the corollary to that is that I was trying to derive meaning from my work instead of bringing meaning to my work. And when we have a life-giving perspective of our work that animates us and energizes it, we can see how all the pieces are integrated. And that led to this completely transformed perspective of work that really has just energized my career for the last 25 years, which is really why I wrote the book and why I'm excited about having these kinds of conversations, is because if God can do it in a guy like me who is so strong-willed, he can do it in anybody. And he wants us and invites us into this human flourishing where we can live our entire lives for him and with him and be co-creators with him in this beautiful world that he's made.
I think it's so easy to look at it and go, well, if I do this, then it's going to diminish my career. It's going to diminish my advancement. It's going to diminish. I don't set goals like I used to. I don't have the accelerator that I used to have. Would you think any of that's true? Or do you believe it's just the opposite?
No, it's a complete lie. Just call it what it is. I often get the question about how do you think about ambition, which is a related question and kind of the question behind your question in many ways. And there's a beautiful translation of the Phillips translation of the scripture that says, make it your ambition to have no ambition of your own. And, we worship a creator who's a very ambitious God. We live in Colorado and I often go out for walks at night under the stars. Creation was a pretty ambitious project.
That's right. That's right.
And so God has tremendous ambition, but the mistake we make is to have our ambition of our own. And the way I describe it is I had the input pipes and the output pipes hooked up backwards. I thought, if I just ambition would be the drive for achievement and that I would be filled up by that. But really, achievement is not an input, it's an output. As John tells us, we love because he first loved us. And when we really absorb the love of God and fall deeply in love with God, as I have, everything we do is an expression of that love. And again, from the inside out. So I think of my life in concentric circles with Jesus at the center and then self, family, society. And so Linda and I have been married 43 years and we have two sons. And so loving Linda or loving our boys or being a steward of the things he's given us or in the outer circle of being a business leader, all of those are expressions of Christ in us as we become less and he becomes more, as John the Baptist tells us, so that it's increasingly no longer we who live, but Christ living in us, that each of those things are just an expression of this Christ in us. And I don't think one is more holy than the other. Loving my wife or our kids, it's just all a matter of, Lord, what have you called me to do right here, right now? And how do I fulfill that call from you in this moment? And so for me, it has just brings this integration because it's all under the lordship of Christ, but he comes into us and through us and out into the world. And importantly, God, he transforms us so that he can transform the world through us.
Right.
It is not we who are transforming the world. And this is a really important point for achievement-oriented people. I chair the Harvard Business School Christian Fellowship and Alumni Association and have for a dozen years or so and work with a lot of high-capacity people. And we talk about the difference between striving and abiding. We're driven for striving, and we think, but really our primary role is to abide. And so that it's not we who are transforming the world, but God transforming the world through us. And there's this freedom in that because God can come into us and out into the world. We're like this empty pipe where he does that, comes into us and out in the world. And I think a big part of the goal of this life spiritually is to let God chip the mud off the inside of that pipe so he can come more fully into us and then be more fully expressed in the world.
I know a lot of what you talk about getting us to the point for God to be able to use us like that is tied around the word surrender. None of this can happen without the word surrender. When you hear and say that word, what does it mean to you? What visuals come to your mind in your relationship with the Lord when you fully just go, God, you got all of me?
Yeah, I mean, the image that comes to mind to me is just these outstretched arms and almost a picture of crucifixion, on the cross. My arms are completely out, Lord, and I just give all of this to you. But it's not one and done. Right? It's what I call the cycle of Isaiah. As the rains come down from the heaven and don't return to it without causing the earth to bud and to flourish, so is my word that goes out from me. That God's word comes into us and through us, and it's like this evaporation cycle. The rains come down and evaporates back up, and it comes into us, and that as it goes through us in every season, God deepens himself in us.
That's right.
And, Jesus is our model here. Even though he was by very nature God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a man. And I think that is the form of our humanity. We are the empty vessel, that our essence is our emptiness when you think about it that way. And so surrender is giving ourselves completely to God so that he will give us the desires of our heart, in both senses of the word, that he will first plant them in us and then he will fulfill them in us. But he wants to replace our human desires, our worldly desires, our desires for the things of the flesh with his own. And that is the work of surrender. I want to just make one other comment on surrender, which is I think it's a very misunderstood word too. It can be equated with complacency. It is not complacency. It takes much more strength to let go than to hang on. Jesus in the garden and on the cross is, I think, the best example of surrender. And I think it took all of his strength to die a death of dignity in accordance with the will of the Father. And he was a warrior in that experience. And I hadn't noticed this until I did a month-long silent retreat when I finished a corporate career about 18 months ago, because I wanted to lay this next season on the right foundation. And a part of that experience was to be with Jesus in his suffering. And I hadn't noticed until that time that I don't think there's any record of Jesus shedding tears. What the record is of Jesus sweating. And it was like drops of blood. And I mean, he was a warrior. So surrender takes tremendous strength to say, Father, I am willing to do your will. But it also is an invitation into beauty. Like sometimes imagine yourself out walking and there's a sunset, and a surrender is just our Father saying to us, how about that sunset? How about that beauty? Look at that. Or going to a symphony and a Philharmonic Symphony and saying, wow, can I just receive this beauty? Or, having dinner with friends. And what is God's will in that? It is to enjoy the gift of fine food and fine friends. And so it's not all dour, and it's not passivity. It's active. It really is just entering into and accepting and doing our very best to embrace the will of God and will of our Father. And
No, go ahead. Keep going.
well, the one final thought on that I would say is that, when Jesus said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me," that, we often think of obedience as this thing that it is dour, but it literally is the source of our sustenance. To obey the will of the Father is literally our food. It's our sustenance. It's what keeps us alive. That's what we're made to do. And when we live within the divine design, we are living into our fullest life. And when we're outside of it, that's the source of the anguish that we've talked about, because we're living outside the divine design, and it creates this deep internal turmoil in us that we may not even be aware of.
How does, and I totally agree with you. I think surrender is something we'll do for the rest of our lives. It's a daily surrender, Romans 12. How does surrender look different for you now in the encore season of your career than it did when you were in the build-up, startup years, when this finally made sense to you and it's all new? How does surrender feel and look different now than it did when you were in your late 40s and early 50s?
Well, I think I'm actually learning what it means more, and I think
Amen.
I'm living it more. The point is to live everything, right? As Jesus was the Word made flesh, I often say tongue in cheek, we are the flesh made Word. We start as flesh, but it doesn't matter how much we
That's
go through
good.
the Bible. What matters is how much of the Bible goes through us. And
Yep.
so it's this process of His Word coming into us. And so I'll give you, just be really practical about it. Here's how it works for me. So as I mentioned, I did this one thing on my bucket list after finishing a corporate career. I don't use the word retirement. I think it's a theologically flawed concept in Americana. But I wanted to do this month-long silent retreat to really lay this next season on the right foundation with Christ as the cornerstone. So out of that came, a vision for the next season. So this encore calling is we invest in three things: our family, the poor, and Christ-following leaders who feel called to live fully for God in the world. And we do it through multiple lines of service. So serving on boards, walking with the poor. We'll make our 24th trip to Central America in a couple of weeks. Writing, speaking, teaching, what my wife and I call holistic accompaniment, coming alongside people. And so that is the vision. And so we've written this down. I have a 10-page list of priorities for the next year. But here's how the surrender gets walked out for me. It's an interesting question of whether people, have you ever thought of your to-do list as God's call for us? And I do. I think, Lord, this is my best sense of what you have in mind for us to do. And that's the vision for the next season. It's this 10-page list of priorities written from the inside out. But God's free to tear it up at any time. And so the way we have done this, so when the book got published and we said, okay, we're now in the middle of this encore calling, is two things. One is I view it as a succession of fleeces. So just take a step like Gideon did, put a fleece out there, and then do what Jesus admonished his apostles to do in the garden, which is to watch and pray. Just watch where the energy is. Watch what things are unfolding as a part of this. And I'm a planner, as is probably evident. But what this does is it raises the question, and I think answers the question of how do you integrate planning and surrender? And that's how I do it. God can't steer a parked car. So it's like, here's our best sense, Lord, of where you'd want to go. And then let's just walk this out through viewing it as a fleece, watching and praying. And I've been amazed at how that has worked. So, kind of blown away with the number of speaking engagements. We're over 20 speaking engagements this year, and I think 30 plus podcasts, and also people who have come along the path. And so we walk together with them. And so it's just this beautiful unfolding picture of, I think, God's design for our lives. And it's a way of living in this freedom that I never knew was possible. It's just the opposite of, kind of plan your work and work your plan and those things that the world would say to us that you just have to buck up and strive. We're still striving. I work hard. I'm traveling 28 out of 31 days in October, just to illustrate the point with all these things. And so I haven't slowed down, but it's done in a different way.
That's right. What surprised you most as you've gotten into this new season, into this new chapter? What surprised you most about what you've learned that God's up to in the world? That you're like, man, I knew he was at work. I didn't know he was at work this way.
I think it has drawn me into conversations like this. and people who are really trying to live fully for God in the world. And it's easy to get upset about all that happens in the world. And with an election coming up, half the people are still going to not be happy after next Tuesday as before. It is not going to solve that, right? And and where we all have, I'm sure, many concerns about where the society is going. And yet, I think the beauty and the surprise of that is just how many people are trying to live for God in the world and to do good work in this way. And it's very encouraging. I spoke at Harvard twice in the last week. And for these young people, many of them students, I told them, I said, I used to tell you that you are the hope of the world, because these are people of capacity of mind, obviously, but also capacity of heart. They're mostly people of faith. And I said, I think that puts too much pressure on you to say you're the hope of the world. But what I really realize is that Jesus in you is the hope of the world.
That's right.
And as we do what we're talking about and we become less, and the living Christ can seep out through our pores a little bit, it makes the world a better place. We run businesses differently. We run athletic programs differently. We still seek to win in athletics because that is what causes us to get up off the gridiron and form our character. So that too is highly integrated. But I think it's been a beautiful surprise and affirmation just to see how many people are doing this, and we know how this ends. I mean, so I think that there's just great encouragement in that.
That's so good. And the book is so good. And one of the things I like in there that you talk about is part of the art of business is when we seek to serve, that serving is at the core of what it's really all about. Unpack that a little bit for our audience, because I think this is so good as we're all in different spaces and places in life doing different things, but yet the heart of serving is thread throughout the Gospels, and I think it's thread throughout us living out our faith. Unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so I came to understand as I was going through these 350 pages that we can have a life-giving or life-draining perspective of our work. And back to it, we don't derive meaning from our work, but we bring meaning to our work. It's God's perspective of our work that is really the source of its ultimate meaning. And so I think that the way I see that playing out in my case was I could not articulate a life-giving perspective of my work. And I was on an airplane to Singapore and made lists of jobs, like Mother Teresa's job. She is cleaning maggots out of the wounds of dying people, which is a true job description. But on the other hand, she said her life-giving perspective was, I am caring for Christ and the poorest of the poor. They're just in this distressing disguise of poverty. You still clean out maggots, but it changes everything to know how you're doing that. And so I could not articulate a life-giving perspective of my work, but it took me several years. Ultimately, it came to me, and the way I describe it was my working job definition was to contribute to a better society as seen through the eyes of God. And then if I am called to business, the corollary question obviously is, well, what's the role of business in contributing to better society as seen through the eyes of God? And out of that, I've concluded fundamentally that the purpose of business is to serve, as you said, Mike. And well, how does business serve? It serves, in I think, four primary ways. We could have a fun discussion about it, but responsible value creation. Have our listeners ever thought about the fact that business is the only institution that creates economic value? Every other institution distributes it. You only have to get off the airplane in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, where we're going next week, to say, there's something different about this place. And there are a lot of things different, but one of them is GDP per capita. And not that money is a solution to the world's problems, but economic value creation is the hallmark of a well-functioning society because it's evidence of people being released to contribute to their potential. So how do I serve as a leader in business? It's to create value responsibly and as well as I can. Serving customers. Literally, when we're serving customers, we're serving God. And our niece and nephew, or her husband, are both physical therapists. And we were having this discussion. And I said, how does this affect the way you think about your work? And Zach got this, really pensive look on his face. And he said, I've been working on a guy who's 80 years old. And I now understand that I am working on the body of Christ. And it changes everything as you're doing your PT exercises, right? So serving customers. And then it's creating an environment that enables people to grow into the full expression of themselves. I mean, that's what I want for myself. That's what God wants for us, life to the full. And I don't know if anyone's ever done the math, but we will work about 100,000 hours in our lifetime. That's a lot of hours to not find fulfillment. And as leaders, we have a huge impact on what it's like to come to work, whether people feel like their gifts are being put to good use, whether they can whether we can make the connections for them about the purpose of the organization and their individual purpose as a participant in that organization. So creating this environment is huge for me. And then being a good corporate citizen, that's a way to serve. When I was at a company that invented voice over the internet, we had a lot of callers who used our service to call to Japan. And when the tsunami hit, we could give free calling to Japan. It was just a way to be a good corporate citizen. And so when I began to see those things and how business contributes to society, my role is to serve, which is to make that business achieve those, I think, sacred values and purposes for business. And you can do that for any role. So while the book's called The Spiritual Art of Business, it's really about whatever business you're in. It's really about living fully for God in the world.
And what I love about it, the core of it, is we're all in the people business. It's all about people. When this life is said and done, everything else will be left here but the influence we've had on people and what we take with that. Final question for today. So number one, I want to say this. I'm incredibly thankful that Julie connected us. I'm just incredibly thankful to have met you and cross paths with you. I love the clarity that you have that helps others find clarity in their own journey. So thank you so much for that. Very helpful. Final question for today. The Bible says in the book of Acts, when David had served his purpose in his generation, he fell asleep. What do you believe is the purpose that God created you for that was uniquely designed for just you?
Wow, I've never had that question before. So there was a book a few years ago that was written, and it had the hedgehog principle. Hedgehogs are only good at one thing. And I've said, Lord, what is that for me? And what I've really concluded, Mike, is that the one thing that God has called me to do is to grow into the full expression of Barry Rowan. And the way to do that is exactly the opposite of the way the world would tell us to do it. It's to submit, as we're talking about, to the living Christ and let him come into us and be expressed through us. And so as we know the story of the rich young ruler who said, good teacher, and Jesus stopped him right there, remember? And he said, why do you call me good? Only our Father in heaven is good. And so what I've really realized is that, again, as we're emptied of ourselves and filled with God, goodness, he is the fulfillment of life. And so the hope is that he who is good will be made whole in me, and that through that we become the living body of Christ. And so that is what I think God has made me for, is to grow into the full expression of who he's made me to be based on my DNA, based on my upbringing. And I'll leave our listeners with just one last thought, which has really been percolating in me. And that is, what if the promised land is within us? And what if that within our very being, this landscape of our souls is the product of our DNA, of all the experiences that we had, and it's filled with streams of living water. And that I think the end of our lives, to me, is what is described in the end of the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, which is with Jesus alone on the throne. All the other gods have been kicked off the throne, and the stream of living water, the flow of the Spirit, flows into us and through us. And this tree of life is planted on either side of that river, yielding its fruit every month. And then here's the important part, and the leaves are meant for the healing of the nations. So I think if we go down, down, down to the very substrate of our being, to this temple within us, it's Jesus alone on the throne, and that picture of this landscape of life that he has given us that resides within us.
Barry was made for this podcast, wasn't he? When he and I sat down and we began to talk, I thought, man, how have I not known you? Your story is the story of what this show is all about. And when it began back in 2017, in the fall of 2017, it was to equip leaders like Barry who didn't know where to turn, who didn't know how to start. And aren't you thankful he's leading for Jesus like he is now and making the difference that he is now? So I hope you'll go pick up his book, The Spiritual Art of Business. It is so good. And so many of you are so good about ordering them for teammates, for friends, to help them find what you have found. Oh, it means the world that you tune in each and every episode, whether it's us and a new guest or Casey and I on takeaways. You doing that really does mean the world to me, and you sharing it and giving us a rating and review also means the world. So if you hit pause and you go to Spotify, iTunes, wherever you listen from, YouTube, where you watch from, and leave us a rating and review, man, share it with friends. It makes a big difference. Well, we'll be back again in our next episode with another repeat guest. I will always bring back the guest guests who speak to me the most because they're always the people I hear from others that they have been spoken to by them as well. And that is another repeat guest, Elizabeth Dixon. Elizabeth, one of my favorite leaders. Elizabeth, the first time we met her was with Chick-fil-A, and she was heading up their customer service. Then Elizabeth wrote a great book on purpose, and now we get to sit down as now she is the CEO of the Trillith Foundation, working directly for Dan Cathy and talking about making the daunting doable. And Elizabeth lives it out every day in the world that she's in. I remember hearing her the very first time we ever met talking about leaving Liberty University and couldn't find a job and ended up at Chick-fil-A running the health for Chick-fil-A in their new corporate headquarters years and years and years ago. And she just climbed the ranks, and she has met and been around some of the greatest leaders in the world. And we unpack that. You're going to love it. So thanks again for joining us today. I don't know what you got on your plate, but here's what I pray. I pray today that you'll love God. I pray today that you'll love people. And I pray today that in the space he put you, that you will live sent. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Lynch with a Leader podcast with your host, Mike Lynch. If you enjoyed this episode, you can help more people hear it by subscribing and leaving a review wherever you may be listening. For full episode notes and more spiritual leadership resources, visit MikeLynch.com.